We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
These are the words that President John F. Kennedy spoke to inspire the race to the moon. The Mercury program was already in full swing. We had flown in space and orbited the Earth, but this speech was intended to bring space exploration to the forefront of the American people. After having success with the Mercury and Gemini programs, NASA was ready to launch the Apollo program, which had helped to land an American on the moon. In March 1966, 3 very special astronauts were chosen to be the crew of the first Apollo flight, which would become known as Apollo 1.
Virgil I. Grissom was a veteran astronaut. He had flown in the Mercury and Gemini programs, and it was speculated that he would be the first man to walk on the moon. Gus was born in Mitchell, Indiana, and he met his wife, Betty Moore, in high school. He joined the Air Force, earning the Distinguished Flying Cross and Air Medal with Custer. After receiving a top-secret teletype, Grissom reported to Washington, D.C. and beat out 103 other military pilots to become one of the original Mercury 7 astronauts. Gus Grissom's first spaceflight was aboard the Liberty Bell 7. Its explosive hatch blew open after splashdown and the capsule sank into the ocean. Gus barely escaped with his life. He never really got over that loss. Gus valued his family's privacy, and he never felt comfortable with reporters. He would even wear disguises to avoid them. The press coined him Gloomy Gus. Grissom returned to space aboard the Molly Brown, which he named because she was unsinkable. When Gus was selected to be the commander of Apollo 1, he was asked about the risks of spaceflight, to which he responded, "If we die, we want people to accept it. We're in a risky business, and we hope that if anything happens to us, it will not delay the program. The conquest of space is worth the risk of life."
Edward H. White was born into a military family in San Antonio, Texas. When Ed was 12, his father took him up flying in a T-6 trainer and gave him the controls. He knew right then and there that he was going to be a pilot. Like his father, Ed attended West Point, where he met his wife, Patricia Finnegan. While in the Air Force, White read about future astronauts and decided he wanted to become one. He earned an advanced degree in aeronautics and became a test pilot. When NASA announced the new 9, Ed White was proudly on that list. White made history when he became the first American to perform a spacewalk on Gemini 4. Ed White was selected to be the senior pilot for the first Apollo mission. He looked forward to the challenge.
Roger Chaffee's lifelong love of flying began when he took his first airplane ride at the age of 7. Roger received a scholarship from the Naval Reserve Officers Training Corps and graduated with distinction from Purdue. Because of his vast knowledge, Roger Chaffee became one of the youngest pilots to fly the A-3D in the Navy. By now, he was happily married to Martha Horn, whom he met on a blind date. Roger was one of 1,800 applicants for the third group of astronauts. After months of testing, he became one of the chosen 14. Chaffee was ecstatic when he was selected to be the pilot for the first Apollo mission. He had been an astronaut for years but had never flown in space. He worked hard and had great respect for his crew. He even began moving and sounding like Gus, which got him teased a lot. Roger Chaffee had always been thought of as the rookie. He hoped that Apollo 1 would change all that.
On January 27, 1967, the crew of Apollo 1 was getting ready to do a routine plugs-out test on Launchpad 34 at Kennedy Space Center. Gus, Ed, and Roger entered the capsule at 1 o'clock p.m. and were strapped into their couches ready for the test, but many things were going wrong. The people at Mission Control tried for hours to fix the problems, but at 6:31 p.m., a voice was heard. "We have fire in the cockpit." 17 seconds after the transmission, all 3 astronauts were dead.
Well, you always feel bad for anything like that. You know the people and they know the risk, but you hope it never ever happens. It was a big learning experience for the program, however, that as tight as the quality and check and cross-checks, obviously they weren't enough. And if you look at the rest of the program, they never had another failure during the Apollo of that kind that lost anybody. So they learned, even though they lost, they learned very much.
Nobody is quite sure how the fire started, but it was most likely started by a tiny spark, maybe a short circuit in the wiring. There were several flaws with the spacecraft, one being cabin environment. In space, it would fly in a pure oxygen atmosphere at 5 psi, but on the launch pad on the day of the fire, the environment was 16 psi pure oxygen. In 16 psi pure oxygen, most non-metallic materials were burned explosively. Unfortunately, in the rush to prepare Apollo 1 for flight, NASA overlooked the possibility of a fire on the launch pad.
Well, yeah, we were sick. We were absolutely devastated. I was down to Florida, not Florida, I was down at Houston about that time, and my friend Clay, who you talked to, I think one of his neighbors was in that fire, and yeah, we were all devastated.
A high-pressure pad test was a fire waiting to happen. All it needed was an ignition source. To try and figure out what went wrong, they took the spacecraft apart piece by piece. Wire bundles on the floor were often stepped on by technicians and the astronauts. The exact ignition source was never identified. The high pressure in the cabin caused the fire to quickly go out of control. The gases were so strong that they actually sealed the hatch doors shut. The hatch consisted of over 12 bolts to open the intersection. That would take much too long to open in an emergency. But Ed White did try. NASA found his body lying right next to the hatch. The hatch was only one problem with the spacecraft. There were many more.
After the fire, NASA came up with a list of 125 things that they needed to change or improve. Within 6 months of the fire, all 125 things were completed. 2 major improvements were fire-resistant Velcro and a redesigned hatch that could be opened quickly. These, along with other changes and improvements, were in fact the triumph of Apollo 1.
It helped a lot, you know. There's a lot of improvements after that in the whole system, not only the command module where they had the fire and the safety precautions they took in that, but in the propulsion system and the handling of the materials and the whole everything. You know, everything was reviewed and everything they could do to make it safer. And as a result of that, and we did pretty well. You know, look at after that. We had the one Apollo where we had some problems with the oxygen system, and they were afraid they were not going to get back, but they did, and that was a real triumph. We were all sitting on our edge of a chair over that one for a few hours. Yeah, those were very traumatic experiences, both of those incidents.
All in all, Apollo 1 was a tragedy and a triumph of 1967. The tragedy was the unexpected fire killing 3 great astronauts. The triumph was that because of the fire, we are able to change many things to make flying in space safer. Because of those changes, a fire should not happen again on the launch pad. Gus, Ed, and Roger were great guys, and whether they know it or not, they are true space heroes.
It's one small step for man,